Hello folks, and welcome back to another movie recommendation. And today we are going to look at quite possibly the most memorable movies of action legend Charles Bronson. And of course, I am referring to the Death Wish series. But before I start, let's talk a little bit about Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was quite an interesting man. He had built his career playing supporting characters in some very popular films, such as The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven, The Dirty Dozen, etc. And after that he had gone on to build a career in action cinema. Bronson presented himself as a stoic but strong action hero in the league of his peers like Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen, Yul Brynner and Lee Marvin. However, he was unfortunately typecast in playing tough guys, which he was good at. However, Bronson reportedly was never really happy with being typecast doing these films. But it seemed like he had nowhere else to go, so he just stuck with the action and thriller genre. Charles Bronson passed away in 2003, but his films will live on forever. And the Death Wish films, while not perfect, are memorable pieces of action cinema. I watched these films on TV when I was about 15 or 16, and they were heavily edited. Eventually, when I turned 18, I bought the whole series on VHS from an ex-rental movie sale for $5. And eventually I got them all on DVD a couple of years ago. Now, where do I start with these films? The beginning, I guess, but first of all, I must say that it really amazes me how this series de-evolved. The first film was a relatively serious thriller, but by the third film onwards it turned into such a ridiculous series of over-the-top action films. But granted, these films are a lot of fun for those reasons alone. And of course, Charles Bronson is a badass and delivers some funny dialogue. So without further delay, let's start with the first film in the series, 1974's Death Wish, directed by Michael Winner.
Is there any chance of catching these men? There's a chance, sure. Just a chance. I'd be less than honest if I gave you more hope, Mr. Kersey.
Charles Bronson is Paul Kersey, a New York architect who lives the quiet life with his family, until one day his daughter and wife are brutally assaulted. His daughter is raped and his wife is killed. Kersey has become a shattered man and turns into a one-man army, hell-bent on wiping out all the scum on the streets of New York. Okay folks, let's get one thing straight. Death Wish is not a perfect film, but it is a good film. Charles Bronson plays a mild-mannered architect, Paul Kersey, with total conviction. He seems like a nice everyday man who loves his family and works hard to support them. And when he finally snaps after the attack on his wife and daughter, he is very believable in how he reacts to the situations around him. When he kills the first mugger he sees, you see Paul Kersey having a panic attack and throwing up in the bathroom. It's quite dramatic. The supporting cast is good also, and they all do their jobs nicely. Vincent Gardenia does a good job as the cop who's on Paul Kersey's trail. Also, we have Hope Lang, who plays Paul Kersey's wife in the film. While her screen time is limited, she's always a joy to see, as she was a great actress. And we also get two very young but very familiar faces playing muggers in the film. Jeff Goldblum plays one of the muggers who is involved in the assault on Paul Kersey's family. And then we have Denzel Washington playing a mugger that Paul Kersey guns down in an alleyway. But what's weird is he's not credited on IMDb as being in this film. But everywhere else, apparently so. That's him right there. They're probably not the best debuts for both these actors, but hey, we all start somewhere. The cinematography in the film has that 1970s desaturated look. It borders on grindhouse at times, but without the grain and scratches. And it fits perfectly. We are taken through the seedy subways of 1970s New York and the smoky and dirty alleyways. You could almost smell the garbage off screen. And it just all fits together so well. And most of the action scenes are shot in wide, which makes it easy to follow what's going on. The jazz fusion soundtrack by Herbie Hancock fits the movie perfectly, as it sounds brooding and menacing, and it's a perfect fit for the subject matter in this film. Now, is there anything I didn't like about the film? Well, I must say, for a movie called Death Wish and one that's rated R, it's not really that violent in terms of graphic bloody violence. I think the film really got its R rating for the assault on Paul Kersey's family, as well as the overall gritty tone of the film. And overall, I think the movie drags in some places and could have used some more development with the relationship of Paul Kersey's wife and daughter. But aside from that, those are the only real complaints I have with this film. Now, a lot of people like to pick on the ending of this film because a lot of people are not fans of it. Now, without spoiling anything, I'll just say that it was a believable ending. The film was a critical and financial success, making $22 million on a $3 million budget, so it did something right, but I'd hardly call this film a masterpiece. But it's by no means a bad film. It's entertaining and Charles Bronson is perfectly cast. Overall, I'd give this one 4 out of 5 stars.
So you believe in Jesus? Well, now you're gonna meet him.
And seeing that Death Wish 1 was a huge success, a sequel was made 8 years later in 1982 with Michael Winner returning to direct. Why it took them so long to do a sequel is beyond me, but then again we finally got Mad Max 4 30 years later, so go figure. This film essentially offered more of the same stuff as the first film did. The plot once again revolves around Paul Kersey, this time living in LA with his daughter and new girlfriend, who is played by Charles Bronson's real wife, Jill Ireland. And this time Kersey's housekeeper and daughter are both raped and killed by another gang of street thugs. And much like Death Wish 1, we have another familiar face here. We get a young Lawrence Fishburne playing one of the muggers. It's amazing how many familiar faces appear throughout this series of films. Overall, Death Wish 2 is a step down from the original, but it's not awful. First of all, Bronson is entertaining as always, the action and violence have been stepped up a lot, and the ending of the film is a little more crowd-pleasing than in the first film. Jill Ireland does okay playing Bronson's wife, but she isn't much of an actress. And Vincent Gardenia also returns as the detective from the first film, and he does a fine job as always. However, my complaint with this film is that it just doesn't look as stylish as the first film in terms of cinematography, art direction, or editing. It looks like it was made for TV in some spots, and of course, this film was notorious for not only the violence but also the rape scenes, which drag on for way too long. There are 2 of these rape scenes, and the first one, from what I have heard, goes for over 3 minutes. It was just unnecessary to keep it going on for that long. In fact, the rape scenes have been edited on most home releases of the movie. For hardcore movie buffs and DVD collectors out there, I believe the early German and Australian DVD releases of the film have the complete uncut versions. I have a US R-rated version which I honestly prefer because the extended rape scenes I think are just unnecessary. They don't help the film in any way, from what I think. And I must say, the music in this movie is uneven. There are some good cues here and there, but most of the time it just sounds too weird and quite frankly cheesy. Not good cheese, but bad cheese. You know, it's not that so bad it's good music, it's just so bad it's bad. And it's hard to believe that Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page composed this score. But all in all, it doesn't really work. It's a far cry from Herbie Hancock's edgy score from the first film. The film was a box office success, but not as successful as the first film. Death Wish 2 made just over $16 million at the box office, but it only cost $2 million to make, so it was a hit. Critically, reviews were negative, and it was the most controversial entry of the series because of the extreme content. Overall, this film is essentially a retread of the first, but with more action, more violence, but no class. But, as a down and dirty action thriller, it does its job. And Paul Kersey, of course, has some great one-liners, and he also dresses like a derelict in this movie and hangs out on the streets so he can get a sense of where these bad guys are and where they hang out. So that was pretty cool, and overall I'd give this one 3 out of 5. Not bad, but not my favourite.
Wildy is here.
In 1985, we got Death Wish 3, once again directed by Michael Winner. Now this one is the fan favourite of the series, and my personal favourite also, but I will say in all honesty, this film is not high art. It is silly, over the top, and ridiculous. However, it does not seem to hide those facts. It is a film that is well aware that it's ridiculous. In fact, I'm pretty sure that director Michael Winner had stated at some point that Death Wish 3 was sort of a comic book style action movie. And you know, if you take it within that context, Death Wish 3 does work as an over-the-top, cheesy comic book style action film. And the good thing about it is it never gets boring. The plot involves Paul Kersey returning to New York to visit an old army friend. However, when he gets there, he finds his friend beaten to death, and all of a sudden the police bust in and arrest Kersey, thinking that he had killed him. However, as Kersey arrives at the station, the police chief recognizes Kersey as the vigilante from years before, and offers him an off-the-books job to help clean up a new breed of scum that walks the streets. And this time, Kersey is bringing in the heavy artillery. So what can I say about Death Wish 3? Well, I can just say that this movie is just plain fun. The action is over the top, but well directed. The scenery and art direction is also perfect. All the streets and alleyways look like a war zone, and you truly feel that no one is safe. Charles Bronson is quite possibly at his best in terms of his physicality in this film, and considering that he was 64 years old when he made Death Wish 3, that is quite impressive. He has no problem running up fire escapes or jumping away from gunfire or explosions. However, his enthusiasm for the role of Paul Kersey has seemed to have diminished considerably. Half the time Bronson looks bored, and I think that may have to do with the negative experience he had in making this movie. It was no secret that Charles Bronson did not like Death Wish 3. However, there are moments where he does shine, especially with the one-liners, and they gave him a good look too. The leather jacket and black jeans really suit him, and his hair also looks good too, as it's greying but in the right places. It's almost like he's got a skunk hairdo. However, the coolest thing Bronson is given in this film is his new weapon, being the .475 Wildy Magnum, a silvery monster of a hand cannon that I'm sure will make Dirty Harry shit his pants. Now, the supporting cast in this movie isn't quite as memorable as the first two films, but there are some noteworthy characters. For a start, this time we have a real main villain, whereas the first film didn't really have one, and the second one tried to develop one in the last 20 minutes, but it didn't really work in that movie. However, in Death Wish 3, we get a head honcho from the very beginning, a guy called Fraker, played by Gavin O'Herlihy, who looks rather weird. That reverse mohawk with a red paint stripe running through it just doesn't quite work for me. However, that is made up for by Fraker's ruthlessness and commanding nature. He runs a huge gang of drug addicts who kill and steal at his command. And we have another young familiar face here, Alex Winter from Bill and Ted and the Lost Boys, playing one of Fraker's buddies. His role is relatively small, but there he is, Alex Winter. The other characters such as the Chief, Kersey's friend, and Kersey's love interest are passable but not really memorable because they don't really have much to do. And seeing that this film was directed by Michael Winner, we do get another rape scene, but at least it doesn't go overboard like the second film. The music once again was composed by Jimmy Page, but I think there was an additional composer because there was some music that just didn't fit with the rest of the score. In fact, I actually preferred the score in this film a lot more than in the second film, but it's still no Herbie Hancock. Death Wish 3 was also the most expensive film of the franchise, costing around $9 or $10 million to make, and considering it was made by the infamous Cannon Films production company, it is really surprising they spent that much money on it because they usually only spend about $2 to $5 million for every other film they make. Death Wish 3 made over $16 million at the box office, and when it came to home video, it made even more money, thus making Death Wish a profitable franchise for Cannon Films. Overall, I'm going to give Death Wish 3 4 out of 5. It's not a masterpiece, but it works as an over-the-top, trashy comic book style action film. There's hilarious dialogue, plenty of action, great art direction, and Charles Bronson, despite being a bit bored in certain places, is given a good look and a cool arsenal. And for the first time in the series, we get a full-fledged villain. So yes, I do recommend this film. Check it out.
Who the fuck are you? Death.
In 1987 came Death Wish 4. Gone was director Michael Winner, and in came veteran director J. Lee Thompson, who had worked with Charles Bronson before and did some more films with him afterwards. Death Wish 4 is a very polarizing sequel because fans seem to be divided on it. Some love it, some don't. I personally liked this one. It's a very polished film and they tried to freshen it up a little bit by adding some new elements, which I welcomed. The plot involves Paul Kersey living in LA once again, and of course he has a new love interest. However, one night Kersey discovers his girlfriend's daughter had died from a drug overdose. Kersey tracks down the pusher who sold her the drugs and kills him. A day later, Kersey receives a mysterious phone call telling him to meet up at a secret location. The person Kersey meets is Nathan White, the owner of a large newspaper company, who has also lost his daughter to drugs. He offers Kersey a job to kill the two big mob bosses who run the LA drug trade. Kersey seems to identify with Nathan White and decides to take the job and destroy the drug mobsters. Now, what I like about this film is that it tries to do something different. Instead of Kersey stalking and killing muggers or shooting them down Rambo style, this time he becomes more of a methodical assassin, kind of like Agent 47 or Golgo 13. He's hired by the newspaper guy, the guy provides Kersey with his list of targets, and he goes to hunt them down. Charles Bronson looks far more invested in this film acting-wise. He is not as physical in this film as he was in Death Wish 3, but he does okay. The supporting cast is good. John P. Ryan does a great job as Nathan White, and the actors playing the gangsters all do a decent job with what they're given. By the way, we do get a brief cameo of Danny Trejo in a restaurant scene. The action scenes are a little more downplayed this time, but they were wise to spread it around throughout the film in short bursts, and then we are given a bigger action set piece towards the end. Whereas in Death Wish 3 they saved one huge action scene for last. But I think it was a wise decision for them to spread the action around a little bit because it flows better. However, I have to say that the film is not as visceral in terms of violence when compared to Michael Winner's first three films. Director J. Lee Thompson seems to be a little bit more conservative in terms of the violence in his films. Now granted, you don't need graphic violence to make an action film, but considering that this series has been established with having a violent reputation, it is a bit of a letdown. However, I am glad that there are no excessive rape scenes in this film. There is an attempted rape in the beginning, but it doesn't go anywhere near as extreme as the first three films. Now sadly, Death Wish 4 didn't exactly set the box office on fire. The budget was $5 million and rumour has it that Charles Bronson took half of the money for his paycheck, and the movie overall grossed just under $7 million. So this is when the series started to take a financial nosedive. But overall, as a movie, Death Wish 4 is a solid sequel. While it's not an original film and it's not going to win any Oscars, it's still an enjoyable Sunday night's entertainment. I'd give it 3.5 out of 5.
Do guns make you nervous?
And finally, in 1994, we got Death Wish 5, The Face of Death. This movie came out a full 7 years later after the fourth film, and this time it's directed by yet another new director, Alan A. Goldstein. Now the first thing you'll notice is Charles Bronson is really old by this point. He was 72 years old when he made Death Wish 5, and I think Bronson and the filmmakers made it a conscious decision to try and bring the Death Wish series back to its roots in terms of making it gritty, much like the first two films. However, the film was made by 21st Century Film Corporation, which was a company put together by Menahem Golan, who was one of the founders of the Cannon Group. So Death Wish 5 still maintains some of those Cannon film hallmarks of over-the-top action and cheesy one-liners. I'd say Death Wish 5 is a little cheesier than the first two films, but not quite as cheesy as the third and fourth film. The plot involves Paul Kersey, who, believe it or not, is back in New York. That's right, after being booted out of New York in the first film and told to leave in the third, he all of a sudden returns to New York like nothing happened. It's like that war zone in Death Wish 3 never happened. Whatever, just roll with it. Anyways, Paul is back. He has a new love interest named Olivia, played by the lovely Leslie Ann Down. She runs a local fashion parlor, and her mobster ex-husband Tommy O'Shea, played by Michael Parks, wants to continue to use her shop as a front for his money laundering operation, despite their divorce. As expected, things get rough when one of O'Shea's goons disfigure her face and ultimately kill her. Naturally, this gets Kersey pretty upset, and he decides to get back into vigilante mode for one last time. Okay, now where to start with this film? Out of all the Death Wish sequels, this one has to be the weakest of the series by far. But granted, it's not a terrible film, it's just not as enjoyable as the previous four. The first problem I have with this movie is the logic lapses are just downright stupid. Two things in particular really bother me. One, why is Paul Kersey back in New York after being kicked out twice? Wouldn't the cops have arrested him as soon as he re-entered? Two, I find it fairly hard to believe that a rich woman who's half Kersey's age would really be interested in him. It's just a little bit far-fetched if you ask me. Also, the plotline has a subplot involving gangster Tommy O'Shea trying to get his daughter back from his ex-wife, which just leads to the relatively straightforward plot becoming convoluted. And overall, you don't really care about the daughter in the long run. The film also feels like it was made for TV at times. The cinematography shifts from pretty slick to average, so it's fairly uneven. And on top of that, we get some silly moments that are really silly. And since this movie's trying to get back to the grittiness of the first two films, it just doesn't work. It feels out of place with all these silly scenes. There's one scene where Kersey uses an explosive soccer ball to kill one of the bad guys. No, I didn't stutter. Kersey really does use an explosive soccer ball. However, before he kills the bad guy, the one-liner he does say is pretty funny. And another silly scene is when Kersey's girlfriend is disfigured. The thug is a guy in drag who puts on this over-the-top attempt at a woman's voice and starts complaining about his dandruff. It's a very awkward scene because it's supposed to be horrifying, but it's ruined by the dialogue the thug is saying, and it comes off as unintentionally hilarious. Now, after all those complaints, is there anything good about this film? Well, yes, there is. I'd say that Charles Bronson does a great job in the dramatic scenes in this film, and he is given some great lines to deliver. One of my favourites being when he is asked if a gun makes him nervous, and Bronson says, "Guns have their uses. Idiots with guns make me nervous." I always liked that one. And despite Bronson being 72, the filmmakers were smart to try and make the action scenes suit his current abilities. They don't have him jumping away from excessive explosions or anything like that. It's more him being tactical, which works. And also, I really like Michael Parks as the villain. He is such an asshole, and you can see he's having fun playing the role. He also has some great lines too. And when he gets it in the end, it's quite possibly one of the nastiest deaths in the Death Wish series. And the music in the film has a very brooding and atmospheric sound that works with the dramatic scenes very well. And the action, while minimal until the final act, is polished and well directed. But Death Wish 5's biggest issue is that it suffers from not being very exciting and as memorable as the previous four films. It was a box office failure, making just under $2 million on a $5 million budget, and it was Charles Bronson's final theatrical film. Despite the failure at the box office and negative reception from both fans and critics, Menahem Golan had plans to continue the series without Charles Bronson, with a sixth film tentatively titled Death Wish 6, The New Vigilante. But 21st Century Film went bankrupt and the idea was scrapped, and there were no further Death Wish films made. Overall, I'd give Death Wish 5 2.5 out of 5. It is the weakest of the series and has many problems. However, the movie is watchable and it does have its moments, so it doesn't hurt to really check it out just once, especially if you're going to watch the whole series from beginning to end. Well, that's my review of the entire Death Wish series, folks. I hope you all liked it, and stay tuned for more. Take care.